Folks in Red Hollow used to say that love was like high-stakes poker. You either walked away rich, or you left with nothing but dust in your pockets. And Clara Mae Dawson had sworn she would never sit at that table again. Not after the last man she trusted rode off with her savings and her faith in one cruel afternoon, leaving her standing on the porch of her late father's ranch with a foreclosure notice flapping in the hot desert wind like a vulture's wings. And from that day on she figured love was a fool's game meant for greenhorns and gamblers who hadn't yet learned how sharp the world could be. Red Hollow lay stretched beneath a copper sky, its wooden buildings sun-bleached and stubborn as the men who drank inside them. And Clara moved through that town with her chin high and her heart locked tight as a bank vault, running Dawson Ranch with calloused hands and a rifle over the mantel, proving every day that she needed no man to mend her fences or count her cattle, though the whispers followed her like dust trails, saying she was too proud, too cold, too broken to ever fall again. The ranch itself sat at the edge of the valley where the prairie met the hills, a spread of dry grass, sturdy barns, and memories stitched into every post and beam, her father's laughter still echoing in the creak of the windmill. And Clara fought for that land with the stubborn grit of a Mustang, rising before dawn to saddle her horse and ride the perimeter, checking fences and chasing off rustlers who thought a woman alone was easy prey. But they learned quick that her aim was steady and her resolve steadier. It was on a late summer afternoon, when the sky hung heavy with heat, that a stranger rode into town, tall in the saddle, hat brim low, coat dusty from miles of open country, and the way he carried himself spoke of quiet confidence rather than swagger, his horse stepping sure along the wooden street as he paused outside the saloon, eyes scanning Red Hollow like he was weighing its worth. And Clara, standing across the way with a crate of feed balanced on her hip, caught sight of him and felt nothing but mild annoyance at the trouble she was certain he would bring. His name was Ethan Calloway, though she did not learn it until later, and he stepped into the saloon like a man who had nothing to prove yet everything to lose, greeting the barkeep with a nod, asking after work rather than whiskey, and that alone set him apart from the usual drifters who passed through Red Hollow chasing cards and cheap thrills. But Clara had seen smooth talkers before, and she paid him no mind as she went about her business, telling herself he was just another shadow passing through by sunset. Word had spread that Ethan was looking to buy land. Not much, just a modest patch along the river where the soil ran dark and promising, and that bit of news pricked Clara's temper sharper than a cactus thorn, for that river bend bordered Dawson Ranch, and she had fought hard to keep greedy hands from inching closer. So when she found him studying a map on the porch of the general store, she marched straight up to him, boots striking wood with purpose, and told him plain that Red Hollow was no place for dreamers. Ethan looked up at her then, eyes the color of storm clouds rolling over the plains, and instead of bristling at her tone, he offered a small smile, saying he had no interest in dreams, only in building something that would last. And there was a steadiness in his voice that unsettled her more than arrogance ever could, for it hinted at patience, at a man willing to play a long game. And Clara felt a flicker of unease she quickly smothered beneath a sharp retort about minding his own affairs that night, as Clara sat alone on her porch, watching lightning dance along the distant horizon. She found her thoughts drifting back to the stranger with the quiet eyes, and she scolded herself for the weakness, reminding her heart of all it had lost when it gambled once before. Yet somewhere deep down a small voice wondered what kind of man rode into a struggling town not to take, but to invest, not to chase fortune, but to build roots. And though she swore love was a fool's game, she could not shake the feeling that someone had just placed a wager she never saw coming. By the time autumn rolled across the valley in streaks of gold and red, Ethan Calloway had not only purchased that narrow strip of riverland, he had begun clearing brush with his own two hands, rising before sunrise and working until the stars burned bright over Red Hollow, and the townsfolk who had first taken him for another drifting dreamer started to look twice, because he did not drink away his evenings or boast about grand plans. He measured timber, dug post holes, and hauled stone like a man laying the foundation for something that mattered. And Clara watched from the ridge more than she cared to admit, telling herself she was only keeping an eye on her border, though her gaze lingered longer each passing day. The first real trouble came when a band of cattle thieves tested the outskirts of Dawson Ranch, thinking Clara's operation had grown soft with the season, but they had not counted on Ethan hearing the commotion from his half-built cabin and riding hard toward the gunshots without hesitation. his rifle steady, his voice cutting through the dark like a whip crack as he flanked the rustlers and forced them into retreat. And when the dust settled and the stolen cattle were driven back through Clara's gate, she found herself facing him under the pale moonlight, pride battling gratitude in her chest because she had not asked for help. Yet he had given it without question. She thanked him stiffly, her words clipped as fence wire. But Ethan only tipped his hat and said neighbors ought to stand together if they meant to survive the winter. And there was no swagger in his tone, no hint that he expected anything in return. And that unsettled Clara more than if he had tried to charm her outright, because she knew how to fend off flirtation. She knew how to outdraw arrogance. But kindness offered freely was a different sort of challenge, one that slipped past her defenses and settled in quiet corners. She had boarded shut long ago. Over the following weeks their paths crossed more often than chance could account for, meeting at the general store over sacks of grain, exchanging brief words at the water trough while horses drank side by side, and each encounter chipped away at the walls Clara had built. For Ethan spoke not of grand fortunes but of steady work, of planting alfalfa by the river come spring, of hiring local hands rather than bringing in outsiders. And she began to see that his gamble was not a reckless one. It was deliberate, thoughtful, as though he had weighed every risk and still chosen to stake his future on this rough patch of land and the people who called it home. It was during the Harvest Social, a yearly gathering where Red Hollow tried to forget its hardships beneath lantern light and fiddle music, that Clara felt the ground shift beneath her boots. For Ethan approached her not with boldness but with a simple request for a dance, his hand extended steady as ever, and though she almost refused out of habit, the memory of his rifle ringing out in the night, the sight of his cabin rising board by board, softened her refusal into reluctant acceptance. And as they moved across the wooden floor she felt the unfamiliar warmth of being held without expectation. The dance was nothing more than a few turns beneath hanging lanterns, yet to Clara it felt like standing at the edge of a canyon, knowing one wrong step could send her tumbling into old pain. And she warned him as much when the music slowed, telling him plain that she did not believe in forever, that men always left when the wind changed. And Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze unwavering, before saying he was not a man chasing the wind, he was one building against it, and if she feared losing a bet, then she ought to know he was wagering everything he had, not on chance, but on her. His words struck harder than any insult could have, because they carried no pressure, only truth. And Clara felt anger flare not at him, but at the vulnerability rising in her own chest. So she stepped back, putting distance between them, telling him he was a fool to risk so much on a woman who had nothing left to give. And Ethan only shook his head slightly, saying that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was believe in something others had stopped believing in, and he would not apologize for seeing worth where she saw ruin that night. Clara lay awake long after the music had faded, and the town settled into silence, staring at the ceiling of her childhood room as memories and possibilities tangled together, for she could see the risk clear as day. Loving again meant opening the door to loss, meant trusting that this man who worked with steady hands and spoke with quiet conviction would not one day ride off into the horizon, like the last one. And yet, as the wind rattled her shutters, she realized something far more dangerous than heartbreak was creeping into her guarded heart. Hope, and hope, she knew, was the most reckless wager of all. Winter did not arrive gentle that year. It came howling down from the northern ridges, with teeth of ice and a temper meaner than any outlaw that had ever passed through Red Hollow. And with it rode trouble wearing a familiar face, the same banker who had once nearly stripped Dawson Ranch from Clara's hands, returning with new papers and colder eyes, claiming missed payments and rising interest had put her land back on the auction block. And though Clara stood tall on her porch as he delivered the news, the wind snapping her coat like a battle flag, she felt the old dread claw at her ribs, because this was not a bluff. This was a final hand dealt hard and merciless. Ethan heard of it before sundown, word traveling fast through a town that had grown protective of its fiercest rancher, and he rode straight to Dawson Ranch without waiting to be summoned, snow spitting against his collar as he dismounted and climbed the porch steps, finding Clara already with rifle in hand and jaw set stubborn as granite. And she told him plain that this fight was hers alone, that she had carried the burden before and would carry it again. But Ethan did not argue. He simply laid a folded packet of papers on the table between them and said he had been saving every spare dollar from the river harvest, every coin from cattle trades and timber work, and he had gone to the bank that morning to place a different kind of bet. Clara stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign tongue, for what they showed was no small gesture, but a full settlement. Ethan had paid the outstanding debt on Dawson Ranch in her name, wagering the entirety of his savings and the deed to his own riverland as collateral, and when she demanded to know why he would risk everything he had built, his answer came steady and unshaken, because some things were worth more than property, and he believed in her fight, in the life she had carved from stubborn soil. And if the world was going to test her again, it would have to go through him first. Pride flared in Clara like a struck match, and for a breath she was furious that he had stepped into her battle, furious that he had made himself vulnerable on her behalf. But beneath that fire was something deeper and far more frightening, the realization that no man had ever stood beside her without asking what he would gain. And here was one who had placed his fortune, his future, and his hard-won land on the line without a single demand in return. And the walls she had built so carefully began to crack, not from force, but from the weight of a love she had sworn did not exist. The banker returned 3 days later, expecting resistance and perhaps a scene, but instead he was met with a signed settlement and a town gathered quiet behind Clara's fence, Ethan standing at her side, not as a savior, but as a partner. And when the papers were handed back across the porch rail, the man's smug certainty faltered, for he could see plain as daylight that whatever scheme he had hoped to profit from had been undone by something stronger than contracts, loyalty woven tight as barbed wire. And he left Red Hollow that afternoon with his hat pulled low, no longer certain the West was as easy to conquer as he once believed. In the stillness that followed, Clara walked the length of her pasture with Ethan beside her, snow crunching under their boots, and she spoke slow, each word chosen careful as a card laid face up, telling him she had spent years believing love was nothing but a rigged game designed to leave her empty-handed. And maybe she had been right once, maybe she had chosen poorly and paid the price, but watching him stake everything without hesitation had shown her something she had long denied, that love was not foolish when it was built on action rather than promises, on sacrifice rather than sweet talk. Ethan stopped near the old windmill her father had raised decades ago, its blades turning steady against the pale sky, and he told her he had not placed his bet expecting victory. He had done it because he could not imagine riding away knowing he had held back, and if she still chose to keep her heart guarded, he would respect that. But he would never regret wagering his all on a woman who fought like the frontier itself, strong, unyielding, and worth every risk a man could take. And there was no plea in his voice, only truth laid bare between them. Clara stepped closer then, the cold forgotten as she reached for his hand, her grip firm, not trembling, and she told him she had been wrong about one thing. Love was a gamble, yes, but the only true loss came from never sitting at the table at all, and if he was willing to bet everything, then so was she, not with money or land, but with trust, with partnership, with a promise to stand beside him as fiercely as he had stood beside her. And beneath the wide winter sky of Red Hollow they sealed that wager, not with grand declarations but with quiet certainty, two stubborn souls choosing each other against the odds, proving that sometimes the bravest gamble a heart can make is believing it might just win.